So yeah, I am here today to talk to you about where releases are kind of right now, particularly with Distillery. This focuses pretty much completely on Elixir. There's not a whole lot of crossover with Erlang, although there is some details that could be shared. But mostly I'm planning to look forward over the next year. I was hired last fall to pick up my work for Distillery full-time and try and get releases merged as a feature into Elixir core. So I'm working with the core team on making that happen. But most of what I'm doing right now is still in Distillery as we work out exactly what the shape of things will be as we move forward here. So, envisioning a more perfect union. What are releases? I am not sure who all here has used OTP releases. I imagine it's a much more significant portion than maybe the Elixir community in general. Can I get a show of hands of who has? Okay, so there's a fair mix of you who haven't yet. All right. So real quick, I'm just going to cover what they are at a high level. Releases just package up your application, so the compiled Beam files, optionally the Erlang runtime system, which is called ERTS for short, additional resources, so like in a Phoenix project, you have priv static. That's something that gets automatically bundled into the release. You can optionally include other directories as well. Include folder is one that is conventionally used in Erlang. Some management scripts, which I'll touch on here more in a minute. The big feature, though, is that when you build a release, it strips out all the code and all the unnecessary bits, and it's just your application in a standalone form. It's a persistent artifact. You can store this somewhere like S3 or whatever and deploy it multiple times. It doesn't have to fetch dependencies, recompile your application, or do anything like that. It's ready to go. So you just drop the tarball on a server, extract it and run it, and you're ready to go. There's obviously some additional steps for things like configuration and so on based on your environment, but that's the gist. The management scripts I was just talking about, real briefly, you can do lifecycle management, so starting, stopping, restarting, all that's exposed right out of the box. And then there's 3 different ways you can run your release. Foreground, which would be the equivalent of like mix run, so it spits out all the output to the standard out. Console mode, which would be like IEX smix, an interactive mode. And then as a service or daemon, which you can start and it gets backgrounded, and that's it. You can put that under like systemd or sys5 init or whatever. Hot upgrades and downgrades are another feature of the management script, so they handle unpacking a release, coordinating the application of updated config files, and actually installing and making permanent the new version of the release, or vice versa if you're downgrading. And then you have a remote shell, so you can connect to the running node after it's already started. And then you can do remote and local code execution, like RPC calls, or evaluating a script in either a local context, which just has all the release code, like all your applications, available for you, but you have to like load and start them manually. Or you can actually do an RPC call to the running node and execute code in that context. So it gives you some flexibility in how you might want to do migrations or interact with the running node in a custom way. So maybe you want to export like a support package for troubleshooting or something like that. You can generate that by talking to the running node. That's all out of the box, at least with Distillery. So Distillery provides, amongst those things, which is sort of like a core OTP release for the most part, you'll find the same thing provided by Relics and some of the other release tooling that's been built over the years. But Distillery specifically wraps that up in a mix task for you so that you can just run mix release in a project and uses all the project information to help generate information, metadata for the release, like tracing all the dependencies that need to be part of it. It also exposes some plugins so that you can hook into various different packaging events. So like before the release is actually built, you can do some prep work while it's actually, while it's actually generating the release itself, so you can manipulate the config programmatically as just a struct. And then after release, it allows you to build a RPM or a .deb or a Docker image or something based on that release. So that's the plugin system. And then configuration providers I'll touch back on later, but that's a new thing that is not currently in the version most of you have probably used if you've used Distillery. And overlays are another method of plugging into the system. So overlays allow you to create directories, copy files in, symlink things, basically template stuff into the release that is above and beyond what would normally be part of the release. You could use that to apply permissions to files in a release or drop in custom config files like an init style thing. There's a bunch of different things you can do with that. Distillery also does a form of automatic app-up generation. So app-ups are used for hot upgrades and downgrades. They're instructions that tell the release handler how to actually apply code changes to the application. For the most part, app-ups need to be written by hand. I mean, if you don't have something like this that kind of sketches out the skeleton for you, you have to know what those instructions are and you have to create this file by hand. Distillery tries to make that easier for you by calculating the difference between an old version and new version by inspecting the Beam files themselves. And so I can tell what modules have been added or removed or changed, and then be able to generate the right type of change instructions based on what was in that module, whether it's a gen server or supervisor, something along those lines. So we can get real close to the right thing, but there's still some caveats with that. Namely, if you change the internal state of a gen server, say you've got a struct, and you change the name of a field, if you don't implement the code change handler, we can't automatically generate something for you that handles that. That's code that you have to write because you know what changed and how it's supposed to be transformed from the old version to the new. So you use that as kind of like a skeleton, spit that out, and from there you make the small modifications you need to make to have it complete. I don't know how common this is in most production applications right now. I don't use them myself, but I have obviously done experiments with it because I think it's a very interesting feature of the runtime. And I know that there are some production applications that are using it. But if you want some real world, battles, stories basically about how you actually do that, probably not the best person to ask. I can give you pointers on how to write app-ups though. And then finally, lifecycle hooks. So this is part of the management scripts that I talked about and allows you to hook into events in shell or using whatever scripting language you want to do things before an application or before the release starts, after it's started, before it's upgraded, after it's upgraded, before it's configured, and after it's configured. So it gives you a bunch of different events that you can hook into to do custom things. Distillery works off a config file under rel config.exs. It's just an Elixir script, just like mix.config, but it's tweaked for releases. You express a release definition in this way, and when you do mix release.init, that's kind of the first getting started step with Distillery, it will generate a default config for you with a release definition based on your mix project. This particular release definition here is sort of what you would maybe do with an umbrella application. You see where I've got set applications, engine, and API. I'm saying that those two applications need to be part of the release. And then Distillery will look at those two applications, figure out what the dependencies are transitively, and pull all those into the release. And it will use the tools that are already in Mix to determine whether a particular dependency is like a dev or prod dependency. So that's all kind of out of the box for you. If you don't have that set applications line, by default what Distillery will do, will look at the release name and match that to an application. So most of the time, if you have a standalone Mix project, called myapp, and you have a release definition called myapp, we know that that's the release for that application. Couple of examples of doing extra configuration here, copy or a view of what the overlays look like. In this case, I'm saying I have this, custom migration script that I want available as like a custom command. So I'm going to dump that in the bin folder of the release. That current version macro is just a way to get the version out of the mix.exs file because that's a really common need. But there's no reason why you couldn't pass in whatever version you wanted there as a string. Distillery also has the concept of environments, which are different from the mix environment. So you might use your mix env, like the prod mix env, for a staging build and a production build, and have slightly different configuration for what the release environment is. So in this example, this would be something where it's more production-ish, because I'm including the runtime, stripping out the source files, saying, hey, I want to pull in this custom vm.args file. The config provider is saying is, again, something I'll get back into later, but this would be a way to say, like, hey, I need to fetch runtime configuration from, in this case, etcd, so use that provider. And then I have a plugin that's going to generate a Docker image at the tail end of this and tagged using that version thing there. You can have multiple release definitions, multiple environments in a single config file, and there are command line flags to select them based on what you need. This is an example of what it looks like to build a distillery release. Pretty straightforward. Once you got that config in place, you just run mix release with the mixenv set to whatever, and we spit out some information here. There's a really good diagnostic output. If you pass -- verbose, it'll spit out a ton of information about how it resolved dependencies and so on. And then down at the bottom here is an example of how you deploy it, really trivially to a local temp folder. You just create the directory, copy the tarball in there, extract it, and run the foreground command to start it up in the foreground. So unfortunately, there are some pain points with the existing tooling, and a lot of the decisions came from when I first wrote EXRM, which is the predecessor to Distillery. A lot of decisions that maybe didn't make a whole lot of sense, but I didn't dig in too deep to try and solve them at the time. I was more concerned with just getting something I could use. So these are kind of the main highlights of what is most painful today with Distillery. The documentation is present, and there's a lot of it, but it's not great. Runtime configuration is a big one. Hands down, I hear about that more than anything else. There are some error messages which are not very friendly. Once things are started, Elixir kind of takes over and you get normal Elixir errors. But really early in boot, there are some pretty obscure errors that if you're not real comfortable with reading Erlang term syntax in its raw form is really awkward. And then finally, just poor integration with mix in general. Beyond the task to build the release, there's no way, well, I'll get into that in a minute. So documentation, like I was saying, it's poorly organized. There's no real ordering to the documentation, no real flow to the docs. I didn't use linking very heavily to make sure that you could get back and forth between different topics easily. I didn't group things because that feature was not in XDoc when I first built this tool. And just in general, it's sort of hard to find what you want. You could use like Google to search it or something, but it's pretty awkward right now. There's some duplicated guides for Phoenix in there. One of them is like really complete with a walkthrough of how to do a hot upgrade and everything, and the other one is much more simple. It was like the first guide. But now they're both there, and there's no real reason for them both to exist. And there's some duplication elsewhere as well. And just in general, there's no real guidance on how to just do basic deployment like tasks. I came from a background where I was really comfortable with this, so I was a little bit surprised how many people were like, I would love a guide on how to deploy to DigitalOcean or ECS or something. And I think that would be really helpful to have, so it's something that I consider an issue today. This is maybe not super easy to see, but this is the current live version of the docs, but it's the bad version of it. If you see on the sidebar here, it's just kind of a mess. It's not real organized at all. This is the landing page. In the first paragraph, there's a Erlang term. It's just, if you're coming from, you have no Erlang background, you just start with Elixir, and this is what you see. Like, what is going on? This is completely new. It's just dumb. I don't know why I did it this way. Oops, sorry. This is the current version on my local machine right now of the same documentation with a bunch of rewrites and stripping out duplicate stuff. But you can see here I'm using that XDoc feature to group things. I ordered each of the pages based on complexity, if you will, so there's some kind of flow to that, at least. And the overview is really simple, just an introduction to Distillery as a tool, but then there's links to get to different topics based on what you're looking for. Some other things I think need to exist are some tutorials. Like I was saying, guidance on how to deploy to DigitalOcean or something like that. Just a little bit more hands-on guiding beginners through how this stuff works. One thing that I really am interested in doing that I haven't really seen so much, but I think would be really valuable, is having comparisons to other languages, how you deploy in those languages. If you're coming from a scripting language, you're probably used to installing all the build tools and dependencies on your production box and just kind of having that mess. And that's really the antithesis of how I think deployment should be done, where you don't have any of that stuff on your production box. But you have issues with native dependencies when you're backing away from having all the build tools there. If all your build tools are on the server, you're never faced with an issue where you need to cross-compile a release. And that was another major pain point for people. So they'd build a release with the Erlang runtime included, which is compiled for a particular OS and architecture, drop it on like a MacBook, and then drop it on a Linux VM somewhere, and it blows up. That's mostly due to the fact that people assumed that they could do that. There was no reason to expect that it would work any other way. That was a failure of the documentation, really. I need to use links a little bit more to kind of create a better flow through the documentation. This is something I've already mostly got done, but I'm still doing more work. And again, more operational guidance, not just on the actual act of deploying, but doing things like maintenance and operations like tasks. For example, you've got a problem and you need to quick fix it by doing a hot patch in production, then how do you do that? You remote shell in, you have the source files there, you do a compile, and then you reload that beam from disk and purge the old code and swap out the processes that we're using. So there's a lot of steps involved there, and you're going to have to learn it all from scratch on the fly in a time where you don't have the time to learn that. So I think those types of tasks are really valuable, tracing in production and so on. Configuration is obviously, like I was saying, one of the big pain points. The reason why it's a big pain point is that config.exs is a dynamic config file. It sort of mushes together compile time and runtime configuration, so you can call functions to fetch values from the operating system environment, or call function to transform whatever, read data in from various files, that kind of thing. The Erlang config file is sys.config, and that is a static config file. I think you can actually specify module function bindings in there, but you can't call functions or do anything like that. So when we translate config.exs to sys.config, and I'll get into why in a second, that's a lossy translation. So it causes a lot of problems. People go to production with releases for the first time, and their configuration is wrong because of that lossy translation, and they're confused what's going on. It worked in dev, now it doesn't work in prod. What's the deal? The reason why we have to do that is because of the way Mix was initially built. So it takes over the boot process. It starts Erlang with just kernel, standardlib, and Elixir and Mix, and then it reads the config file from disk, puts all that in the application.env, or application environment, that's that .putem, .getem stuff. And then after that, it takes over starting all the applications that are part of your project. In a release, what happens is there's a generated file called a boot script that contains the instructions for loading code off disk, starting modules, and so on. It's very detailed. You can actually, it's really interesting to go through and read it because it shows everything that happens in the process of starting the VM. There's actually a default one that's packaged with Erlang. You normally don't see this, but it's called start.boot and startclean.boot. They're in the Erlang installation. And all they do is just load and start kernel and standardlib, I think. So because Mix does that, it doesn't translate to releases. We don't have the same control over the boot. By the time Mix is started, the boot script carries on booting a bunch of other things, and we didn't have a chance to read the config and take over the starting of the applications ourselves. So because of this, it was very difficult to configure things at runtime because the mix config wasn't available. You now had to use strings to specify that you want to use an environment variable or have some kind of static configuration effectively. That meant you had to write code in your application start callback to fetch config from wherever, and each time it would potentially be different. This was awkward for people who had been using mix.config in development, got comfortable with that, and transitioned to production, and now they have to configure things a completely different way. Very harsh transition for beginners. And now that mix.config is a thing, it's painful even for those that aren't beginners. Because it's a thing that's available, it's convenient to use. It has all your configuration in one place. It doesn't mix your application code with your runtime configuration code. It's all contained in one place. And there's no support for other configuration systems. If you want to pull config from like etcd or console or wherever, that had to be part of your application code. And that's effectively a prerequisite for your application booting, right? You need that runtime configuration in place before you can really continue to do anything else. It's just unfortunate that there wasn't really a way to hook into that. And this is ultimately a little self-inflicted. One, there's multiple different ways of doing runtime configuration now in the community. And two, this is somewhat due to the fact that mix.config was written before we had really fully explored how to use releases from Elixir. I think it was sort of happening concurrently, but this happened as an immediate solution to a problem present at the time that ultimately we might look back and say that we would solve it differently. This is a little bit of an example of the problem that we have. So in config.exs, you'll see these different ways of expressing that I have an environment variable that I want to be assigned to some value. So this system var thing showed up, I think, in Phoenix first, or maybe it was Ecto, I'm not sure which. People then piggybacked off that to have a 3-tuple version of it that takes a default, but that wasn't everywhere. That was only in some libraries that managed to do that. And I mean, the first tuple is not even available in very many libraries. It was just a handful that decided to follow that convention. And finally, Distillery itself followed Relic's example, which is to do like this runtime environment variable replacement using awk in the shell script to boot the release. And so you'd have all three of these potentially in one config file. So it's just pure insanity. I mean, if you're coming from any other language, you're going to look at this and be like, this is madness. Who designed this? So the solution that I came up with to solve this problem is something I'm currently calling config providers. This is experimental in nature still because I'm trying to gather feedback from the community, from Jose, from OTP team, and that's not all fully fleshed out yet. But this works currently in master for Distillery. In any case, the way it works is that it is a pluggable system that injects a boot script instruction, that boot script I was describing earlier, that calls a function to initialize the configuration system after Elixir is started, but before anything else, similar to the way Mix does things. The default implementation of this that I've built is for config.exs or mix.config. So it will pull the config file off disk at runtime, read it, stuff in the application env, and then you don't have to use sys.config anymore. But this is potentially extendable to talk to external systems or have alternative on-disk config files. One of the libraries I wrote called conform is used to kind of offer up like a init-style config for ops teams that have no idea what Elixir and Erlang are. They're just responsible for like maintaining this thing. And so those type of systems are now much easier to build with this infrastructure in place. So this is not specific solution to mix.config. It's a more general solution for runtime configuration in general. There are some caveats to building these providers because of where this gets called in the boot process. all the code is loaded, but not all the applications are. So if you wanted to write a provider that depended on some other OTP application actually being started, you'd have a problem there. You need to configure the application, but you need it started to use some of the code in it. I don't think that's very likely to be an issue in practice. If I was going to talk to etcd, all I need is HTTPC. So I just need inets started, basically. And that's fine. Inets doesn't require any configuration that I'm aware of, so potentially we could have it where you can declare dependency on standard lib applications like that. Still ironing out those details, but kind of the thought process there. If you want an example of how this actually looks in practice, this is the Elixir provider, basically. This init function is the thing that gets called during boot. And the single parameter it gets is just a list of whatever you want. It could be a list of strings or a single string, like in this case, which is a path to the config file. But it could be a keyword list or a map, whatever you want to stuff in there. It's configuration for the provider that it needs on boot. For example, if you're working with etcd, this would be where you might pass in the host configuration or DNS name or something like that. Of course, you might have sort of a Ouroboros type situation here where you need to configure that at runtime, but this is your runtime configuration system. I'm basically saying that's you use some of the existing solutions for that, namely the replace OS var thing that's in Distillery that does that runtime environment variable replacement. That's probably how you'd approach working with this. In any case, all it does is it just reads the thing off disk and persists it in the application environment, done. There's a whole bunch more code in here that handles a different problem related to this, but it's something very specific to Mix's config. So, excuse me for just 1 second. Error messages. This is what I was talking about earlier, where with the early boot, a init and application controller are sort of the entry points for the Erlang VM. A init starts the application controller as part of what it does, and then it sends instructions to load and start applications to the application controller. So when errors occur in these two places, for example, you can't load an application off disk because it's missing, or you load the application and you tell it to start it, but something happens early in the application and it crashes. Those errors are not handled by Elixir at all. They're handled by the application controller. And depending on what the error is, you may not get an Elixir stack trace at all and just get this really weird error that just says like init failed during do boot, and it's just a raw Erlang term that's not very descriptive about what actually went wrong. Sometimes it is, not always. Ideally, there would be a way to kind of get in there and actually handle some of those errors, to be able to format them in a better way, or identify common errors that could be summed up in a more friendly way for beginners. Especially if you're coming from just doing development in Elixir, you haven't worked with Erlang at all. The first time you see this error, I've seen it so many times. People just have no idea what it means, no idea how to figure out. It's the first time they've probably ever seen a crash dump generated, and now they have to understand how to read that. And there's not good tooling around that either if you're on a remote machine. There's a crash dump viewer, but if you don't have a user interface on that machine, there's not an easy way to attach that. I know that Raimo mentioned that OTP team is working on some logger changes. I'm hoping that perhaps this fits into the equation somewhere, and we can maybe leverage that somehow. I think it probably is higher level than a init and application controller, but I'm waiting to hear more details on that. The alternative, and it's sort of the nuclear option, is implementing our own init and application controller. Generating your own init requires actually compiling Erlang with that module name embedded. And providing our own application controller would be part of that. So Nerves actually does something similar. It's at a slightly higher level than application controller, but it just starts its own application and doesn't start anything else, and then takes over starting all the applications, just like Mix does. And it does that so that if applications crash on an embedded device, it doesn't take the device offline. You can still get on there and do troubleshooting. And a similar variation of that could be used for Elixir in general, but I'm really hesitant to go down that road. I don't want to re-implement what's in init, an application controller. It's super critical, and we want to be sharing everything as much as possible with Erlang. So, solution for mixed integration in general, I mentioned before that it's sort of this harsh transition between dev and prod, and it's because the development tasks, namely mix run and IX as mix, are not backed by releases, they're backed by mix. And so you do one of these things and it works because Elixir kind of helps you figure things out, like it'll dynamically load code from wherever happens to be present, where in releases the code paths are fixed. And so if you forget a dependency to be declared in production with a release, it will fail. It will say that it can't load that application. This has just been sort of the fundamental difference between running under mix and running under releases is it's much less forgiving in the latter. So what we want to do is we want to take those tasks and back them by some of the release infrastructure, not all of it. We don't need to like generate a tarball with everything or copy erts from around. But what we can do is take the app.start, which is the underlying task behind these two things, and say, I want you to use the boot script to instruct the runtime how to start all these applications. That's kind of the thought process there, and it's something that I'm going to start working on once we actually get some of this infrastructure in Elixir core itself. But until then, it's not really an option. As far as mixed tasks in general, so these are two very specific tasks, right? But in general, you might have mixed tasks that you want to run in production. The trivial example is Ecto's migrate. However, it's also a good example of why we don't need mixed tasks in production, because it has an API, the migrator API. You can call that directly without going through the mixed task. You just have to feed it the direction you're going and the path to where the migration files are. So that's how currently people do migrations with Distillery, is they have a shell script that calls that command, and you might have a thin module on top of it to like load up the paths and everything. And then all it does is calls the migrator API. Ideally, though, we would have something that melds these a little closer together so that you can share the infrastructure, or at least pointed down that direction. Maybe like generating a skeleton task that you then fill in by calling your own code. But right now, I think way too many tasks just sort of assume they're running under a mix project, and a lot of mix itself obviously makes that same assumption. And so until that is either fixed or changed somehow, mixed tasks in general are not really going to be an option. But it is on our mind. I don't want people to feel like it's not, but it's not going to be something out of the box anytime soon. These changes that I'm talking about, I was talking with Jose, we kind of were hoping that Elixir 1.8 would be the target for an initial release of getting this into core, so the mixed release task and all this stuff. That's very much up in the air. Right now, because of the configuration stuff, particularly that we're working on, there's a bit of a question on what the right path forward is. And if it is the config provider saying that's great, but we need to vet it a little bit. We don't want to build this stuff into the release tooling and then change our mind and be like, wait, no, that's a terrible way to do it. There's a much better way. So we're going to vet things a little bit in Distillery and then go from there. The initial release of this tooling, regardless of what release it happens in, is going to be fairly basic. It's not going to have all of Distillery's bells and whistles, but it will give you, the foreground, the console, the daemon tasks, the basic OTP release, some of the commands that actually interact with the node, but it's not going to get super crazy with plugins or anything like that. How we're planning to expose extensibility as part of this is sort of an open question. It may mimic Distillery, but I don't know for sure. And so once this happens, the question is, kind of what happens to Distillery, right? It's still there. At least in the short term, it's going to be a test bed, like I was describing. but down the road, it's really going to consume the core tooling and provide extensions on top of it. I have some ideas of what that might look like, but I really kind of waiting to see how things turn out in core before I make any promises or plans around that. But that's going to be a little bit down the road yet. Distillery is still the primary tool. So, if you're looking at deploying soon or even in the next 6 months, I'd say plan on using Distillery. The core releases that are going to be available whenever it releases will not differ so significantly that it will be painful to go from one tool to the other. It should be a fairly painless transition, unless you're depending on a bunch of the extra features that Distillery provides, which in that case you can just continue to use Distillery. So I'm currently working on 2.0, and I'm very close to a release of this. I was hoping to have it done by this conference, but it's probably going to be end of the month now. But what is in there is the config provider stuff I talked about, which is actually currently working in master. I'm just working on some other things in documentation, but that's there if you want to play around with it. On the AppUp side, I added something called AppUp Transforms, which allows you to programmatically modify the AppUp structure before it's written to disk. So if you want to inject instructions or maybe change the purge mode from like soft, brutal, or back, whatever, or maybe make that conditional based on some other criteria, you can basically do whatever you want to the structure. You get the entire AppUp list of instructions, and you can do whatever you need to with it. And Distillery will validate that what you return is actually a valid AppUp structure still, but it's up to you to do what you want there. The reason I'm adding that is because there are some automatic transformations you want to apply to all of your AppUps, and this eases that by giving you a point where you can actually write some Elixir code to work with this, rather than having to write a plugin that waits for the release to be generated, go read the AppUp off the disk, and then do all this yourself. It kind of exposes it to you in a nice way. I also added a task to generate AppUps for a specific application, and this will put them under rel AppUps, the name of the app and the version of the app, and then just the app name.appup. That path will always be checked when we're looking for an AppUp when a release is being built. So you can generate one using Distillery's generator the first time, make your modifications to it, and then we'll automatically use those modifications when we consume that AppUp. That's been a really awkward point. I don't know why it took me so long to get that into place. What we do right now is it gets generated into the build directory under the ebin folder. So if you do a clean, you just lost your AppUp. If you do a fresh clone, you don't have any AppUps. And that was fine when people were just consuming the automatically generated ones, but as soon as you make modifications to that, which is what I'm recommending people do, there's no facilities for that. Both of these things are there to give those facilities to you. I'm also working on some observer-style command line tools to be part of this. Nothing real crazy complex, but just some basic commands to be able to ask the running node, hey, tell me the top 5 processes that are using memory, or the top 5 processes by reduction count. So you can get a general idea of what's working extra hard. There's a variety of commands, and what I found out, actually, interestingly enough, is that Observer, the UI, is backed by a module in Runtime Tools application called Observer Backend. So you can actually call that thing. You have to kind of know what to do with it, but you can call those functions in there and get the data that Observer works off of, and then transform it for rendering to the UI. So hopefully I can provide an easy way to do remote observation. That's been a pain point for me personally, is particularly running under Kubernetes or something. It's sort of awkward to do remote observer through the Kubernetes overlay network. There's ways to make it work, but this is sort of a way to just be able to hop in and quick get some basic information. I know, I think it was Anthony earlier today mentioned a few tools like ENTOP, Recon is another great one. Both of those tools are much more appropriate for actual introspection of what's going on in production, but I'm hoping that this will give you a little something basic to build off of initially. Another thing that's been missing, particularly for systemd users, is the creation of a PID file. If you're using the daemon mode, it has kind of a hard time detecting the real PID of the process. It usually detects the PID of like the shell script. And so you kill that and the Erlang node's left running. And then it tries to start the app again and it fails because it's already running. You can't have two nodes named the same thing. And so this was created as a library by somebody at some point. I don't remember their name exactly, but this has been something that's been missing for a while, and I just went ahead and made it part of this release. So it will generate a PID file when the node starts and clean it up if it shuts down clean. If it starts up and there's already a PID file there, it will remove it and create a new one. And it puts it in a release version specific directory so you don't have conflicts potentially. Another big change is currently in Distillery, there's an eval task, and an RPC task, and an RPC terms task. Those are inherited from RELX. All three of them talk to a remote node in different ways for calling functions, that kind of thing. I stripped all that out. Eval is now a local only thing for executing code in the context of all the release code, but not the running node. And RPC is the same thing, but for the remote node. Both of them will take a string that's just an Elixir expression. Eval optionally will take a file flag for a script. So if you want to write an Elixir script to do like migrations or something, you can just do bin myapp eval -- file and path to the file. Boom. It'll run that script for you in the context of all the code. I was considering doing the same thing for the RPC, but I'm not 100% sure if I want to do that yet. Looking forward, there's a few things that are sort of painful, but I think maybe are mostly documentation issues, but I think warrant some exploration. First and foremost of those is the cross-compilation story, which is how do I deploy a release from my MacBook to my little DigitalOcean VM? It's easy enough if you're not using NIFs, but if you're not using NIFs, you're almost certainly not working with a real-world application. Almost every real-world application I've touched has NIFs, all of them, actually. So I think it's pretty much a given that you're going to have to deal with a cross-compilation toolchain if you want to make that possible. What I've been doing myself and telling people to do is use a Docker container or a Vagrant VM that matches your production host in terms of OS version, dependencies, that kind of thing. Docker is particularly useful for this. Build your release in there, export it out, and now you can just SCP that tarball wherever. Nerves has an interesting approach using cross-compilation toolchains, and it automates a great deal of the fetching of those toolchains, compiling those toolchains, and then actually using them. But it's a lot to do for something as simple as just I want to build my app and deploy it to my little VM. For larger organizations, maybe it makes sense, but in that case, you almost certainly have a dedicated build server anyways. So the medium, like the happy path there is really just use Docker or Vagrant. I am still potentially exploring some alternatives, but everything I've tried so far has been disappointing to me personally. So what I really think, though, would be a good solution is documenting this process very thoroughly. How do you set up Docker and use it to do this? How do I know, how to specify, getting the release tarball out and dumping it, what storage, wherever I need it. If you're getting into Elixir and you've never touched Docker or Vagrant, which maybe is unlikely, but could happen definitely, you may not be willing to learn this stuff, and it might be a very big point of frustration, cause people to give up, right? So I think if we can cover the documentation of this and ease that path a little bit, it will be much easier for people to get started, at least initially. So, yeah, I have some insane ideas too. I was talking to Brian Trotwine earlier about an alternative Erlang VM that is like Go, that compiles itself into a single executable along with all the Beam files, and then reads them as resources rather than from disk. But that's an insane idea. And getting better at hot upgrades. So I was just in talk by Tier Chen about how they're using hot upgrades and that he had been told, don't use hot upgrades, don't use hot upgrades. You're going to screw up, basically. I am somewhere in the middle where I really recommend you don't unless you have a very clear use case where you need them. And if you think you need them, you probably don't, but you might. But we can get better at helping you generate them and warn you about things that we can see through static analysis, like the case I was mentioning earlier about changing the name of a struct that's used as internal state for a process. We should be able to identify those things via analysis and warn about them. So we can say, hey, you don't have a code change handler for that module, you better implement it or this is going to blow up in production. And potentially there's room for even further static analysis, like maybe we could template out a default code change implementation based on the changes we detected, things like that. Without a strong type system, it's very difficult to do this, but there may be some cases where we can, and I think anything we can do to make that easier is better. And that's basically it. If you have any questions about all of this, feel free to ask me. I do want to give a shout out to Dockyard because they hired me to work on these tools, and if I didn't get hired to work on them full time, I would not have the time to do this. So if you ever get a chance to thank Brian in person, definitely do so. Anyways.